I'm going to talk a lot about zombies and vampires as, if you will allow a slightly pretentious formulation, dialectical doubles. That is to say, each one side of the total experience of horror in a capitalist society. And what's interesting, of course, is that they're everywhere today, zombies and vampires. Sometimes so much so that we don't get the opportunity to step back and ask ourselves, what does the proliferation of these cultural markers, of these particular monsters tell us about the society in which we live? So it's a danger, in other words, that we just take it for granted that they're everywhere. So in 2009, for example, Time magazine declared the zombie, quote, the official monster of the recession. That's pretty good. But not to be left out, one of the most famous articles on the global financial crisis that appeared at the time referred to Goldman Sachs, America's most powerful investment bank, as, quote, a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. So let's be clear, the vampires are getting more or less equal time as well. But I'm going to step back historically and then move forward into the discussion. Because what's interesting is that two monsters made their appearance more or less on the same evening in 1816. Two English authors undertook a horror story competition at a Swiss villa, and one of them was named Mary Shelley. And she went on, as a result of this challenge, to write one of our most famous horror stories of all time, Frankenstein. I'm going to talk a fair bit about Frankenstein in a few minutes. And another person there, John Polidori, wrote the first English language story on the vampire called The Vampire. So Frankenstein and the Vampire are born in the early 19th century. In this 1816 contest, the book Frankenstein appears 2 years later. And while Frankenstein's creature, as I will suggest, morphs later into the zombie, we get here the beginnings of two monster tropes which have stayed with us for nearly 200 years. And when that's the case, I think we need to probe deeply and to ask ourselves what's going on. Why is it that these idioms of horror so dominate within the cultural landscape of capitalism? Because for nearly 200 years, dissection, body snatching, blood sucking, dismemberment have all been cultural themes or cultural tropes around which horror is organized via the popular imaginary. And it all speaks, I'm going to suggest, in part to this profound sense of corporeal or bodily vulnerability that everybody who gets subjected in some way or another to the labor market experiences in capitalist society. Or to put this part of the argument as succinctly as I can, capitalist society produces cultural fears or anxieties about being dissected and about being the living dead. And I think it does so because of profound experiences associated with wage labor. Let me start to unfold that argument by taking a closer look at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Several things are really interesting about the way Shelley sets out this book that tend not to get very much attention from most commentators. Most commentators rush incorrectly, and I'm happy to come back to this in discussion, to say it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of science. That's not fundamentally what the book is about. It is not fundamentally about the dangers of science. Victor Frankenstein, Shelley tells us early on, engaged in dissection and grave robbing. Now note those two themes, because they become incredibly important. How does he assemble his monster? He dissects animals and he robs human graves. And he assembles this monster by putting together cut up bits of bodies to create this gigantic monstrosity, which then gets jolts of electricity to be brought to life. Shelley has him tell us this. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, he explains, and spent days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. Now, Shelley's readers immediately knew the significance of this. And they knew the significance of it because in one of the houses in which she had grown up, she was around the corner from the most famous prison in London where public hangings took place. And at most public hangings in 18th century London, this, by the way, was utterly unique in terms of European cities. Very frequently, after the body of the condemned had been hanged, a pitched battle took place, sometimes lasting for hours, over the body of the victim, over the body of the condemned. Who was it between? It was between the so-called anatomists, the doctors or those who engaged in dissection and anatomy, who wanted more bodies to chop up, and the crowd that gathered there, often unrelated, but sometimes there were relatives of the condemned, who fought them off for hours. Money would change hands as they tried to buy the body, to bribe the crowd into giving it up. This didn't happen in any other European city, these battles. I think it's not an accident that London was at the economic and commercial heart of that country going through the most rapid proletarianization in the world at the time. That is to say, more and more poor people being turned into wage laborers, and in the early stages of industrial capitalism. The riot at the gallows, the riot over the body of the hanged, became a key contestation over the bodies of the poor in London. But note also that Victor Frankenstein engages in grave robbing, not just in dissection. This, too, was a class marker in 18th century London, because given that there was what has been described as a corpse economy throughout London, other British cities, but particularly London, a corpse economy meaning that corpses were getting more and more expensive, and indeed there were price lists for different sizes and sexes of corpses, and indeed price lists for each part of the body that could be bought. So there was a literal corpse economy happening, and as a result, the rich began to have themselves buried in things like iron coffins, padlocked, and so on. The poor were often thrown into paupers' graves. Very easy to dig them up at night. And so-called resurrectionists, or grave robbers, there were crews of them throughout London that would raid the graves of the poor and dig them up and have them sell off the corpses as part of this corpse economy to be cut up. And so we get in this period in London, the period where Mary Shelley starts to compose Frankenstein in the early 19th century, a culture of resistance against the corpse economy, against dissecting the bodies of the poor. Now let's step back and ask ourselves why this is so important, and why Mary Shelley knew this was going to resonate. To set up Victor Frankenstein in this way, she knew was to set him up as a monstrous character before he constructs his creature. And think for a moment about what it means to sell your labor power in societies where there is no tradition of doing this. And think as well about the fact that we can make almost a trans-historical, trans-cultural generalization that in one society after another, people resist being subjected to wage labor. They will do almost anything they can to cling to a small plot of land and try to reproduce themselves outside the market. Because once you enter the market, several things happen. One, loss of autonomy. You surrender freedom, you surrender autonomy. Secondly, you enter the economy of dead time. You enter the economy where for 8, or in those days, 10 and 12 hours a day, your life energies, your time does not belong to you. It belongs to somebody else. And if you think of all the expressions that workers use to describe time on the job, and I've used dead time as the most resonant of those, you can see what's going on. Marx puts it this way: The exercise of labor power, labor, is the worker's own life activity. Under capitalism, his life activity is for him only a means to enable him to exist. It is a commodity which he has made over to another. Now, to make over your life activity to someone else as a commodity means to treat it as a thing, to treat it as inanimate, to treat it as dead. This is to part with some of your fundamental humanity, yourself, as a human. As a result, life at work is a form of living death. It is experiencing death, lack of animation, lack of autonomy, lack of control, lack of creativity, lack of human self-expression, and so on, day in and day out, over and over again for a lifetime. And of course, central to it is the idea that your body is seized. And in one way or another, that body is disciplined, regulated, punished, and so on, by the forces of capital, supervisors, foremen, and so on, within the capitalist economy. And so anatomists didn't only symbolize the physical cutting up of the human body, they also symbolized the cutting up of our lives into dead parts and living parts. That metaphor, I'm suggesting, is one of the things that accounts for the great endurance of Frankenstein as a story across now nearly 200 years. Moreover, in seizing a body from the anatomists, in preventing it from being cut up, the crowd was winning a symbolic victory against capital. They were basically saying, there are certain indignities we protest, and if they couldn't resist the labor market entirely, they could at least resist this ultimate indignity of the physical dismemberment. You may be dismembering our lives, you may be cutting up our life experience, but here is one moment where we can win a small victory back, reclaim bodies from the corpse economy. But Mary Shelley doesn't only do that. She also sets out another monstrous trope. And this is something I'll come back to towards the end of my remarks. She sets up the rebel monster or the proletarian monster. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is the monster that many of us identify with in zombie films. The moment when the zombies turn the world upside down, trample polite society, scare white, rich, suburban people by marauding through the streets and wreaking havoc and creating a zombie carnival. And what Shelley does is to threaten the ruling class that this is what they're creating. Think, to begin with, even of the imagery of assembling the monster. What is the proletariat? It is people thrown together in the most random way as a result of the cutting up of human lives and throwing them together into these big collectivities in factories, mines, mills, on ships, and so on. Much the same way that Victor Frankenstein grabs body parts and animal parts and throws them all together to create this huge monstrosity. That's what the working class is, particularly from the standpoint of the ruling class. One thing we need to remind ourselves always is how utterly frightened the ruling class is by the specter of plebeian or proletarian insurgents. That is their cultural nightmare, and it's one of the things that gets enacted quite often in zombie films as well. So there is that, but more than that, Mary Shelley's creature has a series of features that the Frankenstein creature loses in Hollywood films. To begin with, he has language. The creature speaks. Boris Karloff, the most famous of the creature actors in Hollywood, insisted that the creature should be deprived of speech, i.e. turned into a zombie. Shelley gives him speech. Moreover, he learns to read. And one of the texts that he hears read, interestingly, one of the most interesting scenes in the book, by an Arab feminist, and he hears her read, is probably the most important revolutionary text of the late 18th century by Volney called The Ruins, which, among other things, in addition to condemning class society, made the profoundly anti-racist claim that human civilization had begun in Africa. Incredible claim to be making in the late 18th century, by the way. Of course, we know he was right, but It has this powerfully anti-racist working class thrust. And it was the book of the radical and revolutionary left in France, Britain, and so on. And the creature hears this entire book read. But the capacity for speech, of course, is part of the threat to the ruling class. The monster is not a completely inarticulate, non-rational, unthinking brute. It's capable of communication, it's capable of thought, it's capable of analysis. But as I say, Hollywood zombifies the creature by stripping him of speech and intelligence. As that happens, there becomes an interesting point of intersection with the historical development of the zombie image. The zombie image begins in West Africa, but it has its most profound formation in Haiti. Haiti, of course, was the largest slave colony that France had. It is also the site of the enormous slave revolution that defeats 3 colonial empires. And the zombie imagery in Haiti becomes particularly resonant during the period of US military occupation after 1915, when US Marines imposed forced labor on large parts of the population. And this idea of being turned into a mindless beast of burden, to be literally stripped of your humanity, of personality, memory, identity, language, and thought, to be turned into nothing but human flesh that labors for others, emerges in Haiti during this period of time. And there's an amazing book written by an American author which becomes hugely influential at the time. His name is William Seabrook, and it's called The Magic Island in 1929. It's full of all kinds of ethnocentric racial stereotypes and so on. But the depiction of zombie labor, particularly in a chapter called Dead Men Walking in the Cane Fields, was hugely influential in Depression America. That's when the zombie image first starts to make an impact. The book comes out in 1929. What does the Depression bring home other than we're being treated as nothing but mere anatomies capable or not of work? I won't spend too much time on that book, although I'd love to, but I want to make sure that I'm not abusing my time. It's this view of the zombie as the mindless laborer which becomes the main cultural trope of the zombie, the main image of the zombie during the period of the Depression. After that, after the 1940s, the zombie image starts to die out within popular culture, only to undergo a tremendous resonance and renaissance, particularly with the appearance in 1968 of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Undoubtedly one of the great classic zombie films, except, I want to spend a moment on this, Romero didn't think his creatures were zombies. He didn't call them zombies. His original name for the film was Night of the Flesh Eaters, and he described them as ghouls. Now, why is that important? Because remember, I'm saying that coming out of Haiti, the zombie is a laborer, stripped of identity, memory, consciousness, and so on. The zombie in the post-1968 period becomes a consumer, not a laborer. A manic, insane flesh eater. Okay? There are lots of critical possibilities with this shift, but something I'm going to argue gets lost with this shift. To depict, for example, a voracious US imperialism at the time of the Vietnam War as a manic, flesh-eating machine does have a lot of critical charge. And look, folks, it's really telling us something that this film is set not in Transylvania, but in Pennsylvania. Okay? You know, it's telling us that America is a scene of horror. Okay? That it is the site of these insane flesh-eating monsters. And interestingly, there is one heroic character in the film, the single black male in the film, and he is the one heroic character. Everybody else is susceptible to idiotic panic. He's the one person capable of actually rationally planning a defense, and of course, he's ultimately murdered by a kind of posse run by a real kind of redneck white sheriff type. So there are lots of critical possibilities with the idea of the zombie, even though, as I said, Romero didn't think of them as zombies, as manic consumers of human flesh. But the danger here is that one of the really critical insights of the original zombie formulation, the mindless laborer, simply being a laboring working machine, gets lost. And I want to suggest to you that a lot of that happens after the New Left goes into decline, as the anti-war movement and Black Power movements recede. It becomes very easy for the zombie metaphor to become a kind of easy cliche in which we just depict our society as choking on its excess of consumption and so on. And I'm not denying that there's some critical possibilities there, but I think it does tend to lose some of the amazing critical charge that exists. You can still see, I think, some of what's possible with it, for example, with Romero's 1978 film Dawn of the Dead, where, I mean, the zombies are drawn manically to a shopping mall. Okay? I mean, that's where they want to be, and they want to get into that shopping mall at all costs. Okay? And so, you know, there is clearly a critique of manic hyper-consumerism as something that drives capitalism. But as I said, the danger of that metaphor is that it loses sight of human labor as what drives the machine, is that it starts to drift into those analyses of late capitalism in which everything revolves around consumption. The shopping mall is the center of capitalism, as opposed to the place of work, the site of labor and production. Interestingly, at the same time as that was happening, sub-Saharan Africa became the site for the return of the zombie laborer. And I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about this. This happens beginning in the mid or late 1970s. And interestingly, sub-Saharan Africa becomes that region of the globe most ravaged by structural adjustment programs, neoliberalism, privatization, commodification of fuel, food, housing, water, and so on, electricity, the greater subjection than ever of daily life to the market that happens in one urban center of sub-Saharan Africa after another throughout this period. And what we get is the emergence of what commentators have described as a, quote, new witchcraft. This new witchcraft essentially switches from older idioms in which witches devour people to new idioms in which, in fact, what sorcery does, what witchcraft does, is to seize you and turn you into a zombie laborer. And so in one part of sub-Saharan Africa after another, and in the book I go through pages and pages of, I think, incredibly interesting kinds of stories about this. Everything from the stories in Nigeria, you get on a motorcycle taxi, which is, by the way, absolutely common in places like Lagos. You put on your helmet, and the next thing that happens is you're entrapped in a room somewhere spewing money out of your mouth like a human ATM, basically. Or some of my favorites are stories, this one comes in variants from at least 5 or 6 different countries, of part-time zombies. You get seized in your sleep. You wake up utterly exhausted in the morning. And the reason you wake up exhausted is that in your sleep you were taken to a secret nighttime plantation economy, worked like a zombie, you have only the faintest memory of all of this, and now you wake up exhausted again and of course have to go and try to make a living for the next day. But what you get again in sub-Saharan Africa is the relationship between zombie labor on the one hand and fantastic accumulation of wealth on the other. The mysteries of capitalist accumulation are being explained via the metaphor, the imagery of the zombie laborer. And I want to suggest to you that that always carries a powerful critical charge. That rather than being some weird superstition, this is incredibly insightful. That people are using this zombie labor image to explain how it is that some people in a city like Lagos, which has its walled sections, its gated communities, where the nouveau riche are getting fantastically wealthy, while the majority are living in essentially shanty towns and so on. So I'm not trying to say that that's the whole story, by the way, with any of these images. There are lots of other things that always run through these images. Issues around race, an AIDS pandemic, sexuality, and so on. But I want to emphasize what I think has gotten lost in so much of the discussion, which is these class resonances. Because what you're seeing in this shift from an older to a newer witchcraft in sub-Saharan Africa is from the idea that witches are interested in use value, in consuming you, to the idea that witches are interested in exchange value. Not consuming you, not eating you up, but turning you into a means of production, turning you into a force of labor. Now, what we get today, in other words, if you take both sides of this imagery, is essentially a return to the vampire and the zombie laborer. The vampire is, after all, a consumer of others. The vampire lives off your blood. The ghoul zombie, that is the manic consumer, lives off your flesh and blood. The zombie laborer produces this immense wealth. And so when I said earlier there's a dialectical doubling here, I'm trying to suggest that each of these images projects to us one side of capitalism. Immense accumulation of capital and wealth, the hidden, usually invisible labor that sustains it. The idea of going onto invisible plantations, for example, at night, speaks to something that Marx talks about all the time in Capital. The fact that the source of capitalist wealth is invisible. It's hidden. When we move through the shopping malls, the circuits of commodities, we do not see the labor that brought these commodities into being. And one of Marx's great tasks in Capital is to de-invisibilize or to re-visibilize what it is that drives the immense machinery of capitalism. He tells us that to do this, we need a journey to the hidden abode of production. What the zombie laborer does is to remind us of that hidden abode. That somewhere, however out of sight it might be, labor is happening. And labor is driving this machinery. Now, I want to spend my last couple of minutes coming back to the other monster that Mary Shelley introduces us to, which is to say the rebel monster or the proletarian monster. And here I'll suggest to you a couple of interesting places to follow this up, and then I'll say a little bit about one really interesting film. I said I wasn't going to talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer at length, but I'm actually going to talk to you about a film that I quite like. But before that, I want to say that many of these vampire images and zombie images, these witchcraft images from sub-Saharan Africa, are amazingly, profoundly, imaginatively reworked in the amazing novels by the Nigerian writer Ben Okri, his Famished Road trilogy. If you want to read one of the great contemporary African writers who really works with some of these themes, look at Okri's novels, and particularly the Famished Road trilogy. But one place where some of this also comes back, that is to say the idea, remember I talked about, of the zombie revolt, the great thrill and non-guilty pleasure that we get from seeing the zombies turn polite society upside down, maraud through wealthy white neighborhoods, strike fear and trembling into the heart of the bourgeoisie, and so on, is in a Wes Craven film from 1991 called The People Under the Stairs. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this film because it's got one of the great zombie rebellions on screen. The premise of The People Under the Stairs is that there is a wealthy family of capitalist landlords who are only ever known as Daddy and Mummy. I mean, you've got a patriarchy theme, you've got a race critique theme, and you've got a class critique theme all happening in this film. Daddy and Mummy are buying up property in the African-American ghetto. Just outside the enormous home they live in, that was once a funeral home. Corpse economy, folks. There was once a funeral home where they made immense profits by selling shoddy caskets to poor people and then doing their funerals. Okay? So these people have accumulated through the death economy, are now buying up property, and in their basement under the stairs, they have imprisoned all kinds of particularly young white people, okay? The white people that are chained up, locked up under the stairs, are kept busy watching screens of the 1991 bombing of Baghdad, okay? These are, in other words, people hypnotized by the spectacle of war, patriotism, and so on. For a variety of reasons, a 13-year-old black youth who's only ever known in the film as Fool has to get in to this house. Now, Fool, by the way, for those of you who know a little bit of long-time popular culture, particularly in Shakespeare and elsewhere, fools are subversives. Somebody called Fool can say things to the king that no one else can say. Someone can speak back to power with comedy and ridicule. So it's very interesting the way it's set up. Anyway, Daddy and Mummy get wise to the fact that Fool is in their house. Fool wants to find the secret source of money, by the way, because they're going to get evicted. He eventually does find the money. But in order to overthrow the rule of Daddy and Mummy, he needs to make an alliance with two young whites who've broken away from everybody else. Then, at a key moment in the film, Fool's sister shows up at the front door with a bunch of folks from the local black community, and she announces, when Daddy and Mummy step to the door, by the way, they're shooting up their house at this point, trying to get them, she announces, quote, "I represent the association of people who have been unduly exploited, evicted, and generally fucked over." And what ensues is now this convergence of a rebellion of the poor African Americans from the local community and the whites who had been kept under the stairs into a kind of zombie rebellion that overthrows patriarchal racial capitalism, Mummy and Daddy's rule, on the one hand, and in this amazing scene, their secret vault of money gets blown up, and it all rains down on the people. While Redhead Kingpin and the FBI sing, "Do the Right Thing." Now, I'm telling you this story because I want to end on the note of the proletarian monster, the rebel monster, the zombie rebellion. Because, to me, ultimately, that's what drives the great critical power of the zombie film. The idea that zombie rebels can de-zombify themselves, that they can come out of their stupor, that like Victor Frankenstein's creature, they can read or hear great revolutionary classics like Volney's The Ruins. They can come to higher levels of self-understanding and analysis. They can make alliances and change themselves into something truly frightening for the ruling class. So that as much as zombies and vampires are markers of the horrors of capitalism, there are also certain currents, particularly within the zombie idiom, which are markers of what terrifies the ruling class. And what I try to do at the end of the book is talk about how in those hopeful monsters, as they say in evolutionary biology, in those hopeful monsters of the zombie rebels, we can see something of the possibilities of the carnival of the oppressed or the festival of the oppressed that is actually what a genuine working class revolution is about. And so when we think about the monsters of the market, we have to remember not only that it's describing the monstrosities that we experience as working class people within capitalism, but there's also the hopeful glimmer of the monsters that can bring down that system of monstrosity. Thank you.